The neighbor seemed perfect, until they discovered his second family. Hi everyone! Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. Margaret Henderson had lived on Maple Street for 37 years, long enough to see families move in and out, children grow up and leave for college, and neighborhoods transform from young and vibrant to mature and settled. In all that time, she had never seen a family quite like the Carlsons. They had moved in 3 years ago into the large colonial at the end of the street that had sat empty for months after the previous owners relocated to Florida. Robert Carlson was the kind of man who made other husbands look bad simply by existing. He was tall and handsome in an understated way, with graying temples that made him look distinguished rather than old, and the kind of genuine smile that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world when he talked to you. More importantly, Robert was helpful. Not in the overbearing way that made you feel indebted, but in the natural, neighborly way that seemed to come from genuine kindness. When Margaret's ancient oak tree had fallen during a storm last winter, blocking her driveway, Robert had appeared with a chainsaw and 2 of his teenage sons before she'd even had time to call a tree service. When the Hendersons next door had their new baby, Robert's wife Linda had shown up with casseroles for a week straight. When old Mr. Patterson had fallen on the ice, it was Robert who had driven him to the emergency room and stayed with him until his daughter could arrive from out of state. The Carlson family was picture perfect in a way that seemed almost too good to be true, but somehow wasn't. Linda was a petite blonde with a warm laugh and the kind of effortless style that made other women wonder how she always looked so put together. Their 3 children, Michael, 17, Sarah, 15, and little Emma, 8, were polite, well-behaved, and genuinely seemed to enjoy spending time with their parents. They took family bike rides on Sunday mornings, had barbecues in their beautifully maintained backyard, and could often be seen working together in their garden, which was the envy of every homeowner on the street. Margaret had lived long enough to develop a healthy skepticism about families who seemed too perfect, but the Carlsons appeared to be the genuine article. She had watched them through her kitchen window for 3 years, and the happiness seemed authentic. The children laughed easily and spoke to their parents with respect rather than fear. Linda and Robert held hands when they walked to the mailbox together, and Robert was the kind of father who never missed his kids' soccer games or school plays. It was Robert's involvement in his children's lives that had first caught Margaret's attention in the most positive way. Unlike many fathers in the neighborhood who seemed to view parenting as their wives' primary responsibility, Robert was genuinely engaged. He coached Michael's baseball team, helped Sarah with her math homework, at the kitchen table most evenings, and could often be seen playing elaborate games of pretend with little Emma in their backyard. The family attended the local Presbyterian church every Sunday, and Robert had volunteered to help with the youth group. Linda was active in the PTA and had organized several successful fundraisers for the school district. They were the kind of family that made other parents aspire to be better, the kind of neighbors who raised property values simply by existing. Which was why Margaret felt guilty about the small seed of curiosity that began growing in her mind sometime during their second year on Maple Street. It started with Robert's travel schedule. He worked in sales for a medical device company, which explained why he had such a nice house and could afford to take his family on elaborate vacations. But lately, it seemed like his business trips were becoming more frequent. Margaret, whose bedroom window faced the Carlson driveway, had begun to notice that Robert's silver BMW was gone more often than it was there. She told herself it was none of her business. Successful salespeople traveled frequently. Everyone knew that. And it wasn't like Robert was neglecting his family. When he was home, he was completely present, engaged. the model husband and father. If anything, his dedication to his family, when he was in town, seemed to make up for his frequent absences. But Margaret was a naturally observant person, a quality that had served her well during her 40-year career as a high school principal. She noticed patterns, inconsistencies, the small details that others missed, and she was beginning to notice things about Robert's travel schedule that didn't quite add up. For instance, Robert had told her just last week that he was heading to Chicago for a 3-day conference. But on the second day of his supposed trip, Margaret had seen him at the grocery store across town. She'd been visiting her sister, who lived on the other side of the city, and there was Robert, loading groceries into his car in broad daylight. When she'd mentioned it to Linda the next day, casually, not wanting to cause problems, Linda had looked confused and said that Robert was still in Chicago and wouldn't be back until Friday. Margaret had rationalized it away. Maybe his conference had ended early, and he'd decided to surprise his family by coming home a day ahead of schedule. Maybe he'd stopped at the store to pick up something special for them. There were any number of innocent explanations. But then there was the incident with the dry cleaning. Margaret had been dropping off her winter coat at Pristine Cleaners, the same establishment she'd used for 15 years, when she'd overheard a conversation between the owner, Mrs. Kim, and her daughter, who worked behind the counter. "That nice man, Mr. Carlson, he came in again today," Mrs. Kim had said in Korean, not realizing that Margaret understood the language after living in Seoul for 2 years during her husband's military deployment. Always so polite, always in a hurry. But strange, no? He picks up clothes for 2 different addresses. Maybe he picks up for his neighbors, her daughter had suggested. Maybe. But why would he have shirts and suits at both places? And the woman's clothes at the other address, they're not the same size as the ones from Maple Street. Margaret had felt a chill run down her spine. She'd paid for her dry cleaning quickly and left, but Mrs. Kim's words echoed in her mind for days afterward. Why would Robert be picking up clothes from 2 different addresses? And what did Mrs. Kim mean about different-sized women's clothing? The seed of curiosity was growing into something more troubling. Margaret tried to push her suspicions away, telling herself she was being ridiculous, but she found herself paying closer attention to the Carlsons, watching their house with new eyes. And that's when she began to notice other things. Robert's travel schedule wasn't random. There was a pattern to it. He was gone most weekends, allegedly visiting clients or attending conferences. But conferences were typically held during the week, weren't they? And sales calls on Saturdays and Sundays seemed unusual for a medical device company. More concerning were the phone calls. Margaret had noticed Robert taking calls in his backyard, pacing back and forth across his deck while talking in low, urgent tones. When Linda or the children approached, he would quickly end the calls or move further away from the house. Once, Margaret had seen him get a call during a neighborhood barbecue, and he'd walked clear to the end of his driveway to take it, his body language tense and secretive. Then there was the day Margaret had decided to drive across town to try a new restaurant she'd read about. She'd been stopped at a red light when she'd seen a familiar figure crossing the street. It was Robert, but he wasn't alone. He was walking hand in hand with a woman Margaret had never seen before, a tall brunette in a sundress, clearly younger than Linda. They were laughing together, completely at ease, the way couples do when they're comfortable with each other. Margaret had stared in shock until the car behind her honked and the light had turned green. By the time she'd found a place to pull over, Robert and the woman had disappeared into a restaurant. Margaret had sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to convince herself that she'd been mistaken, that it had been someone who just looked like Robert, but she knew what she'd seen. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Robert Carlson, perfect husband and father, beloved neighbor and pillar of the community, was having an affair. But even that didn't explain everything Margaret had observed. The dry cleaning from 2 addresses, the frequent weekend trips, the secretive phone calls. This felt like more than a simple affair. This felt systematic, long-term, carefully orchestrated. Margaret spent several sleepless nights wrestling with what she'd discovered. Should she tell Linda? Should she mind her own business? What if she was wrong? What if there was an innocent explanation for everything she'd seen? But deep down, she knew she wasn't wrong. Her instincts, honed by decades of dealing with teenagers and their elaborate deceptions, were screaming that Robert Carlson was hiding something big, something much bigger than a simple affair. The confirmation came 3 weeks later, during what should have been a routine trip to the farmer's market. Margaret had driven to the weekly market, held in the parking lot of a church about 30 minutes from Maple Street. She enjoyed the fresh produce and the sense of community, and it had become part of her Saturday morning routine. She was examining tomatoes at one of the stands when she heard a familiar laugh. She looked up to see Robert Carlson standing near the flower vendor. But he wasn't alone. The same brunette woman from the restaurant was with him, along with 2 children, a boy who looked to be about 10 and a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. They were clearly together, clearly a family unit. Robert was holding the little girl's hand while the boy helped the woman select bouquets of flowers. Margaret watched in fascination and horror as this second family interacted. Robert's demeanor was identical to how he behaved with Linda and his other children, warm, engaged, paternal. He lifted the little girl onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd, just as Margaret had seen him do countless times with Emma. He ruffled the boy's hair affectionately when the child made a joke that made everyone laugh. This wasn't an affair. This was a second family. Margaret felt sick to her stomach as the full implications hit her. Robert wasn't just cheating on Linda. He was living an entirely double life. He had somehow managed to maintain 2 separate families, 2 separate households, 2 separate existences. The weekend business trips weren't to conferences or client meetings. They were to his other family. She watched, frozen in place, as Robert and his second family made their way through the market, completely at ease, completely natural. They looked just as happy and well-adjusted as the Carlsons on Maple Street. The woman, who Margaret now realized must be Robert's second wife, was pretty in a different way from Linda, with dark hair and a more athletic build. The children were well-behaved and seemed to adore Robert just as much as Michael, Sarah, and Emma did. How was this possible? How could one man maintain 2 separate lives so completely that neither family seemed to have any idea the other existed? The logistics alone were staggering. 2 mortgages, 2 sets of bills, 2 birthday parties for every holiday, 2 sets of parent-teacher conferences, 2 everything. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to piece together how Robert could have managed such an elaborate deception. His job in medical sales provided the perfect cover. Frequent travel, irregular hours, conferences, and client meetings that could explain his absences. He was clearly making enough money to support both households, which suggested he was successful at his work. But the emotional and logistical complexity of maintaining 2 families simultaneously was almost beyond comprehension. She followed them discreetly through the market, staying far enough back to avoid being noticed, but close enough to observe their interactions. Robert paid for groceries with a credit card, and Margaret made note of which vendor he used, thinking she might be able to find out more later. The children called him Daddy, just as naturally as his other children did. The woman, his second wife, wore a wedding ring. As they prepared to leave the market, Margaret made a decision that she would later question many times. She followed them to the parking lot and watched as they loaded their purchases into a blue minivan that she'd never seen before. She memorized the license plate number and watched as they drove away, Robert at the wheel, his second family chatting happily around him. Margaret sat in her car for a long time after they'd disappeared, trying to process what she'd witnessed. The perfect neighbor, the man everyone admired and respected, was living a lie so elaborate and complete that it boggled the mind. He wasn't just deceiving his wives. He was deceiving his children, his neighbors, his entire community. The question now was what to do with this information. Margaret's first instinct was to protect Linda and the children. They deserved to know the truth about the man they'd trusted with their lives and hearts. But she also knew that revealing Robert's secret would destroy not just one family, but two. There were innocent children involved, 5 of them, if her count was correct, who would be devastated by the revelation of their father's deception. She spent the next several days researching, trying to find out more about Robert's second family, without directly confronting anyone. Using the license plate number, she was able to determine that the minivan was registered to a Catherine Walsh at an address in Millbrook, a suburb about 40 minutes from Maple Street. A quick internet search revealed that Catherine Walsh was a kindergarten teacher at an elementary school in that district, divorced, with 2 children from a previous marriage. The pieces were starting to fit together. Catherine had been divorced when Robert met her, already had 2 children who needed a father figure. Robert would have been the perfect solution: stable, financially secure, great with kids. And if he'd told her he traveled frequently for work, she wouldn't have questioned his regular absences. But that still didn't explain how he'd managed to marry Catherine without Linda knowing about it. Unless... Margaret felt another chill as she realized the most likely explanation. Robert probably hadn't actually married Catherine legally. He was already married to Linda, so a second marriage would be impossible. But Catherine clearly believed they were married. She wore a ring. The children called him Dad. They functioned as a family unit in every way, which meant Robert wasn't just committing adultery, he was committing bigamy, or at least the pretense of bigamy. He'd somehow convinced Catherine to participate in what she believed was a legitimate marriage while maintaining his actual marriage to Linda. The level of deception was staggering. Margaret knew she had to act, but she wasn't sure how. Confronting Robert directly seemed dangerous. If he was capable of this level of deception, who knew how he might react if cornered? Telling Linda outright seemed cruel. How do you tell a woman that her entire life is a lie? And what about Catherine and her children, who were just as much victims as Linda's family? The decision was made for her 2 weeks later, when Linda knocked on Margaret's front door. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me bothering you," Linda said, looking uncharacteristically frazzled. "But I was wondering if you'd noticed anything strange about Robert lately." Margaret's heart started pounding. "Strange how?" Linda stepped inside and accepted Margaret's offer of coffee, settling into the familiar chair at Margaret's kitchen table, where they'd shared many friendly conversations over the years. But today, Linda looked different. Worried, uncertain, vulnerable in a way Margaret had never seen before. "I feel silly even saying this," Linda began, stirring her coffee nervously. "But Robert's been different lately, more distant. And his travel schedule has gotten so crazy that I barely see him anymore. He's gone most weekends now, and when he's home, he seems distracted." Margaret chose her words carefully. "Have you talked to him about it?" "I've tried, but he always has a perfectly reasonable explanation. New territory to cover, important clients to maintain, industry conferences. And when I push too hard, he gets frustrated and says I'm being clingy." Linda's voice cracked slightly. "But Margaret, I've been married to this man for 20 years. I know when something's not right." 20 years. Margaret felt sick thinking about how long Robert had been deceiving his family. How long had the second family existed? How many years had he been living this double life? "Linda," Margaret said gently, "what exactly are you worried about?" Linda was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. "I think he might be having an affair," she whispered finally. "I know that sounds terrible, especially about Robert, but I can't shake the feeling that there's someone else." Margaret's heart broke for her friend. Linda's instincts were right, but the reality was so much worse than she imagined. "What makes you think that?" "Little things, mostly. He started being very secretive about his phone. He never used to be. He takes calls outside now, and when I walk into the room while he's talking, he changes his tone or ends the conversation quickly. And..." Linda hesitated, looking embarrassed. "I found a receipt in his pants pocket when I was doing laundry last week. It was for dinner at an expensive restaurant in Millbrook, but he'd told me he was in Denver that night for a conference. Millbrook, the same suburb where Catherine Walsh lived with her children. Margaret felt like she might be sick. Maybe there's an explanation, Margaret said weakly, knowing there wasn't. That's what I keep telling myself. But then yesterday, I decided to do something I've never done in 20 years of marriage. I called his office to see if they could give me the hotel information for his conference in Portland this weekend. I told them I wanted to send him flowers as a surprise. Margaret held her breath. Margaret, there is no conference in Portland. His secretary seemed confused and said Robert had requested the time off for personal reasons. She thought it was strange that I didn't know. The silence stretched between them as Linda's words hung in the air. Finally, Linda looked up at Margaret with tears in her eyes. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to confront him about this without seeming like a crazy, suspicious wife. But I can't keep pretending that everything is normal when I know something is terribly wrong. Margaret stared at her friend, weighing her options. She could continue to say nothing, let Linda discover the truth on her own. She could offer vague advice about communication and trust, or she could tell Linda what she'd seen and change her friend's life forever. Looking at Linda's tear-stained face, Margaret made her choice. Linda, she said quietly, there's something I need to tell you, and I'm afraid it's going to be very difficult to hear. Over the next hour, Margaret told Linda everything. The sighting at the grocery store during Robert's supposed business trip. The conversation she'd overheard at the dry cleaners. The woman she'd seen him with at the restaurant. And finally, the devastating scene at the farmer's market. The second family that looked just as happy and complete as the one sitting in front of her. Linda listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Margaret finished speaking, Linda sat motionless for several minutes, staring at her hands. 2 families, she finally whispered. He has 2 families. I'm so sorry, Linda. I struggled with whether to tell you, but when you came here asking about your suspicions, I knew I couldn't let you keep wondering and doubting yourself. Linda looked up with an expression Margaret would never forget, a mixture of devastation, rage, and something that might have been relief. 20 years, Margaret. 20 years of marriage, and I never knew. How was that possible? How could I have been so blind? You weren't blind. Robert is clearly very skilled at deception. This isn't your fault. But it is, isn't it? I should have known. All those business trips, all those weekends away. I should have questioned it more, should have been more suspicious. Linda, listen to me. You trusted your husband because that's what wives are supposed to do. You had no reason to suspect he was capable of something like this. Linda was crying now, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. What am I going to tell the children? Michael's applying to colleges, Sarah's got her first boyfriend, Emma still believes in fairy tales. How do I destroy their world like this? Margaret moved to sit beside Linda on the couch, putting an arm around her friend's shaking shoulders. I don't know, but you'll figure it out, and you won't be alone. What about the other family? Do you think she knows? Catherine? Margaret shook her head. I don't think so. She seemed just as comfortable and happy as you always have. I think she believes they're legitimately married. So there are 2 families about to have their lives destroyed. Yes. But Linda, living a lie isn't really living. Whatever pain is coming, it's better than continuing to be deceived. Linda pulled away and looked at Margaret with new determination in her eyes. I need proof. I need to see this for myself before I confront him or tell the children. I need to be absolutely certain. Are you sure? Maybe it would be better to just... No. I need to see them with my own eyes. I need to understand exactly what my husband has been doing with his life while I've been home raising his children and keeping his house and believing in his lies. Margaret understood. Linda needed to see the scope of Robert's betrayal for herself before she could begin to process it. How do you want to do this? Linda wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. This weekend. He's supposedly going to Portland for a conference. I'm going to follow him instead. Linda, I don't think you should do this alone. Will you come with me? Margaret had been afraid Linda would ask that, but looking at her friend's devastated face, she knew there was only one answer. Of course. The plan was simple. On Saturday morning, when Robert left for his supposed conference, Linda and Margaret would follow him at a safe distance to see where he actually went. Linda had already arranged for her sister to watch the children, telling them she and Margaret were going shopping in the city for the day. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Margaret's mood perfectly. She picked up Linda at 8 a.m., and they positioned themselves in Margaret's car at the end of Maple Street, where they could see Robert's driveway, but wouldn't be easily noticed. At 8:30, Robert emerged from his house, carrying a weekend bag and what appeared to be a bouquet of flowers. He kissed Linda goodbye at the front door, a kiss that Margaret now realized was a lie, just like everything else about Robert Carlson. He waved to his children, who had come to the door to see him off, and got into his BMW with the cheerful demeanor of a man heading off for a routine business trip. Linda sat rigidly beside Margaret as they followed Robert's car through the suburbs, maintaining a careful distance. Instead of heading toward the airport or the interstate that would take him to Portland, Robert drove directly to Millbrook. He navigated the residential streets with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, and pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-story house on Elm Street. Margaret parked several houses away, and they watched as Catherine Walsh came out to greet Robert with a kiss that lasted much longer than the one he'd given Linda an hour earlier. The 2 children Margaret had seen at the farmer's market ran out of the house and launched themselves at Robert with obvious joy and affection. He lifted the little girl into the air and spun her around while the boy grabbed his free arm, both of them talking excitedly. This was a man coming home to his family. There was nothing furtive or guilty about his behavior. He was completely comfortable here, completely at ease. This wasn't a weekend affair. This was Robert's other life. 20 years, Linda whispered beside her. He's been doing this for 20 years, and I never suspected a thing. They watched as Robert helped Catherine and the children unload what appeared to be grocery bags from his car. He handed Catherine the flowers, and she stood on her toes to kiss him again. The little girl wrapped her arms around his legs, and he scooped her up while putting his other arm around Catherine. The boy helped carry bags into the house, chattering constantly. From a distance, they looked exactly like the Carlsons on Maple Street, a happy, loving family unit. The only difference was that this family didn't know they were sharing Robert with anyone else. I want to see more, Linda said grimly. I want to understand exactly how he's been living. Margaret was reluctant to spy further, but she understood Linda's need to see the full scope of her husband's deception. They spent the day following Robert and his second family around Millbrook, watching them shop for groceries, attend what appeared to be the boys' soccer game, and have lunch at a family restaurant where Robert and Catherine held hands across the table while the children colored on their placemats. At the soccer game, Margaret and Linda sat in their car in the parking lot and watched Robert cheer from the sidelines just as enthusiastically as he did at Michael's baseball games. Other parents came over to talk to him and Catherine, and it was clear they were well-known and well-liked in this community too. Robert wasn't just maintaining a second family, he was maintaining a second entire social life. Look at him, Linda said, her voice hollow. He's the same man here that he is at home. The same devoted father, the same charming husband. How is that possible? Margaret didn't have an answer. Robert's ability to completely duplicate his personality and behavior across 2 separate lives was beyond her understanding. This wasn't a man who was conflicted or guilty about his double life. This was a man who had somehow managed to compartmentalize his existence so completely that he could be fully present and authentic in both places. As the day wore on, Linda's shock began to transform into something harder and more determined. I want to talk to her, she said, as they watched Robert and Catherine push the children on swings at a neighborhood playground. "I want to talk to Catherine." "Linda, I don't think that's a good idea. Not today, not when you're this emotional. When would be a good time to tell a woman that her husband is already married to someone else? When would be a good time to destroy her world the way mine has been destroyed?" Margaret could see the logic in Linda's argument, but she was worried about the potential for confrontation. "What are you hoping to accomplish?" "I want to know what he told her. I want to understand how he convinced her to marry him when he was already married to me. I want to know if she has any idea what kind of man she's living with." As they watched, Robert and Catherine gathered up their children and headed back toward their car. It was late afternoon, and they appeared to be heading home for the day. "Now," Linda said, "I want to talk to her now, while Robert's there. I want him to see that his lies are finally catching up to him." Margaret's stomach clenched with anxiety, but she could see that Linda was determined. Nothing she could say would change her friend's mind at this point. "Okay, but let's be careful. We don't know how Robert will react when he's cornered." They followed Robert's family back to the house on Elm Street and watched them go inside. Linda sat in the car for several minutes, gathering her courage, while Margaret tried to think of ways this confrontation could go wrong. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked one more time. "I'm sure," Linda replied, opening the car door. "It's time for the truth to come out." They walked up the sidewalk to Catherine's front door, and Linda rang the doorbell with a steady hand. After a moment, Catherine answered, still smiling from whatever family activity they'd been engaged in inside. When she saw two strange women on her doorstep, her expression shifted to polite curiosity. "Can I help you?" Catherine asked. "Are you Catherine Walsh?" Linda asked, her voice remarkably calm. "Yes, I am." "I'm Linda Carlson," Linda said simply, "Robert's wife." The color drained from Catherine's face, and Margaret could see the exact moment when the implications of Linda's words hit her. Catherine's hand went to her throat, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "That's impossible," Catherine whispered. "Robert and I are married. We've been married for 8 years." "I know you think you are," Linda said gently, "but Robert and I have been married for 20 years. We live on Maple Street, about 40 minutes from here. We have 3 children together, Michael, Sarah, and Emma." Catherine stared at Linda in stunned silence. Behind her, Margaret could hear the voices of Catherine's children and the sound of Robert moving around inside the house. "You're lying," Catherine said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm not lying," Linda replied. "And I think you know I'm not. I think some part of you has always wondered about his frequent business trips, about why you've never met his work colleagues, or why he's never taken you to company events." Catherine's face crumpled, and Margaret realized that Linda was right. Some part of Catherine had suspected something wasn't right about her marriage, even if she'd never imagined anything this devastating. "Kathy, who's at the door?" Robert's voice called from inside the house. Catherine looked back toward the sound of his voice, then back at Linda and Margaret. "Oh, God," she whispered, "this is really happening." "Yes," Linda said, "it's really happening." Robert appeared behind Catherine, and the smile on his face died the moment he saw Linda and Margaret standing on the doorstep. For the first time since Margaret had known him, Robert Carlson looked completely at a loss for words. "Hello, Robert," Linda said with icy calm. "How was your conference in Portland?" The silence stretched between the 4 adults, while children's laughter echoed from somewhere inside the house. Robert's face had gone completely white, and he seemed to age 10 years in the span of 10 seconds. "Linda, I can explain," he began. "Can you?" Linda interrupted. "Can you explain how you've been married to both of us simultaneously for 8 years? Can you explain how you've managed to maintain 2 complete families without either of us knowing about the other? Can you explain how you could look me in the eye this morning and kiss me goodbye while you were coming here to spend the weekend with your other wife?" Catherine made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp. 8 years? She turned to look at Robert with horror. You've been married to her for our entire marriage. Robert opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. For a man who had managed to maintain an elaborate deception for years, he seemed completely unprepared for this moment of truth. Daddy, who are those ladies? The little girl Margaret had seen at the farmer's market appeared beside Robert, looking up at the adults with innocent curiosity. The sight of the child seemed to galvanize Catherine. Go inside, sweetheart, she said, her voice shaking. Take your brother and go play in your room for a few minutes. But Daddy... Now, Emma, Catherine said firmly, using the same name as Linda's youngest daughter. Margaret wondered if Robert had been so lazy in his deception that he'd given both his youngest daughters the same name, or if it was just a terrible coincidence. The little girl disappeared back into the house, and Catherine turned to face Robert, with tears streaming down her face. Is it true? Everything she's saying. Is it true? Robert looked between the two women he'd been deceiving for years, and Margaret could see the exact moment when he realized his double life was over. His shoulders sagged, and he seemed to shrink into himself. Yes, he said quietly. It's true. Catherine let out a sound of pure anguish and collapsed against the doorframe. Linda remained standing straight and tall, but Margaret could see her hands shaking at her sides. How? Catherine whispered. How could you do this to us? To the children? How could you do this to anyone? Linda added, her voice rising slightly. 20 years, Robert. 20 years of marriage, and you've been living with another family for 8 of them. How is that even possible? Robert ran his hands through his hair, looking more lost and desperate than Margaret had ever imagined he could look. I never meant for it to happen like this. I never meant to hurt anyone. But you did hurt everyone, Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with anger. You've destroyed 2 families with your lies. The children, Linda said suddenly, her composure beginning to crack. Oh God, Robert, the children. 5 children who think you're the most wonderful father in the world, and now they're all going to find out that their entire lives have been built on lies. As if summoned by her words, voices began drifting from inside Catherine's house, her children asking why she was crying, wondering who the strange ladies were. And Margaret knew that across town, Robert's other children were probably wondering why their father hadn't called from Portland yet. We need to figure out how to tell them, Catherine said, wiping her eyes and trying to compose herself. All of them. They deserve to know the truth, but they deserve to hear it in a way that won't destroy them completely. Linda looked at Catherine with something that might have been respect. You're right. Whatever else happens, the children have to be our priority. Robert looked between his 2 wives with an expression of complete defeat. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make this right. You can't, Linda said simply. You can't make this right, Robert. You can't undo 8 years of lying to Catherine and her children, and you can't undo 20 years of lying to me and our children. The only thing you can do now is tell the truth and try to minimize the damage to the people who trusted you. Margaret watched this exchange with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Both women were showing remarkable strength in the face of unimaginable betrayal, thinking of their children even as their own worlds crumbled around them. I should go, Linda said finally. Catherine, you and Robert need to figure out how to tell your children, and I need to go home and figure out how to tell mine. But, she hesitated, then looked directly at Catherine. I want you to know that I don't blame you for any of this. You were deceived just as much as I was. Catherine nodded, tears still streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I had known... I know you didn't, Linda said. And I'm sorry too. Sorry that we're both victims of the same man's selfishness. The 2 women looked at each other for a moment, united in their shared betrayal, despite being strangers. Then Linda turned to Robert with a look of pure disdain. Don't come home tonight, she said. Don't come home until you've figured out exactly what you're going to say to Michael, Sarah, and Emma about why their father has been lying to them their entire lives. And when you do come home, it's only going to be to pack your things and leave." With that, Linda turned and walked back toward Margaret's car, her head held high, despite the tears that had finally started to fall. Margaret looked back at Robert and Catherine one last time. Robert was standing in the doorway, looking completely broken, while Catherine had her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold the pieces of her life together. The sound of children's voices calling for their parents drifted from inside the house. Innocent voices that would soon learn that the world wasn't as safe and predictable as they'd believed. Margaret followed Linda to the car, and they drove home in heavy silence. There was nothing to say that could make sense of what they'd just witnessed. No words that could adequately capture the scope of Robert's betrayal or the pain that was about to ripple through two families and an entire community. When they reached Maple Street, Linda sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the house where she'd lived for 3 years, believing she was living a happy, normal life with a man who loved only her. "I keep thinking about all the times I felt guilty for doubting him," Linda said quietly. "All the times I told myself I was being paranoid or unreasonable. My instincts were right, but the reality was so much worse than anything I'd imagined." "How could you have imagined something like this?" Margaret replied. "No one could have imagined this." Linda laughed bitterly. "Two families, Margaret." He convinced 2 women to build their entire lives around him, to trust him completely, to let him be the center of their worlds. And he did it so well that neither of us suspected anything was wrong until it was too late to do anything but watch everything fall apart. They sat in the car watching Linda's house, the house where Robert's other children were waiting for their father to call from his fake conference, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The perfect lawn that Robert maintained so carefully, the flower beds he'd planted with Linda's help, the swing set he'd built for Emma in the backyard, all of it was about to become evidence of a lie rather than symbols of a happy family life. "What are you going to tell them?" Margaret asked. "I don't know," Linda admitted. "How do you tell your children that their father is a fraud? That everything they believed about their family was a lie? Michael's 17. He's old enough to understand what this means. But Emma," Linda's voice broke, "Emma still thinks her daddy hung the moon. How do I destroy that for her?" Margaret reached over and squeezed Linda's hand. "You'll find a way. You'll find a way to tell them the truth while still protecting them as much as possible, and they'll be okay eventually. They have a strong mother who will help them through this." "Do I? Do I have any idea how to be a single mother? I've been dependent on Robert for everything, financially, emotionally, practically. I haven't worked outside the home in 15 years. I don't even know how to balance a checkbook anymore." "You'll learn, and you won't be alone. There are people who will help you." Linda nodded, wiping her eyes. "I keep thinking about Catherine. She's facing the same thing I am, but she's been a single mother before. Maybe she's stronger than I am." "You're both stronger than you know. Robert didn't choose weak women. He chose strong women who trusted completely." "That trust wasn't a weakness, Linda. It was what made you both good wives and mothers." Linda finally opened the car door. "I should go in. The kids will be wondering why I'm sitting in the driveway crying. I need to figure out what I'm going to say when Robert doesn't call tonight, like he always does." Margaret watched her friend walk up the path to her front door, shoulders squared despite the devastating blow she'd received. Linda paused at the door and looked back. "Thank you," she called out, "for telling me the truth, for coming with me today, for everything. I know it wasn't easy for you." "Take care of yourself, Linda, and call me if you need anything. Anything at all." Margaret drove home to her own quiet house, but she couldn't settle down. She kept thinking about the children, all 5 of them, who were about to have their worlds turned upside down through no fault of their own. She thought about Catherine, who was probably having the most difficult conversation of her life with her 2 children. She thought about Linda, who was trying to figure out how to explain the inexplicable to 3 teenagers who had trusted their father completely. and she thought about Robert, who had somehow managed to live with himself while perpetrating this massive deception for years. How did someone compartmentalize their life so completely? How did he kiss Linda goodbye in the morning and then spend the weekend playing family man with Catherine and her children? How did he attend parent-teacher conferences for 5 different children without ever getting confused about which child belonged to which family? The phone rang around 9 p.m. It was Linda. "It's done," Linda said simply. "I told them." "How did they take it?" "About as well as you'd expect. Michael is furious. He keeps saying he wants to kill his father, which is probably normal, but still scary to hear from your 17-year-old. Sarah locked herself in her room and won't come out. And Emma..." Linda's voice broke. "Emma asked me if Daddy still loves her, or if he loves his other little girl more." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Oh, Linda. I told her that Daddy loves all his children the same, but that he made some very bad choices that hurt a lot of people. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but I don't know what the right thing to say is in a situation like this." "There probably isn't a right thing to say. You're doing the best you can in an impossible situation." "Robert called about an hour ago. He wanted to come over and talk to the kids, but I told him no. Not tonight. They need time to process this before they have to face him. And honestly, I need time too. I don't think I can look at him right now without wanting to do something I'll regret." Margaret understood completely. The betrayal was so massive, so complete, that Linda probably needed time to work through her anger before she could have a rational conversation with Robert. "Where is he staying?" "I assume with Catherine and her children. They're going to have to figure out their own situation now. As far as I'm concerned, Robert made his choice 8 years ago when he decided to start a second family. He can live with the consequences." Over the following days, the story of Robert Carlson's double life spread through both neighborhoods like wildfire. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as neighbors who had once admired Robert walked past his house with expressions of disgust and betrayal. The perfect family that had been the envy of Maple Street was now the subject of gossip and speculation. Linda handled the aftermath with remarkable grace. She met with a lawyer to begin divorce proceedings and to understand her rights regarding the house and Robert's assets. She enrolled in a computer course at the local community college, preparing to re-enter the workforce after 15 years. She found a support group for divorced women and began attending weekly meetings. Most importantly, she worked with a family counselor to help her children process their father's betrayal. It wasn't easy. Michael's anger didn't fade quickly. Sarah struggled with trust issues that extended beyond her relationship with her father, and little Emma had nightmares about being abandoned. But slowly, gradually, the family began to heal. Margaret learned through mutual acquaintances that Catherine had ended her relationship with Robert immediately after the confrontation. Unlike Linda, Catherine hadn't legally married Robert, which made the separation simpler from a legal standpoint, but no less devastating emotionally. She had moved back to her hometown with her children, wanting to start fresh somewhere that didn't hold memories of the life she'd built with a man who had never truly been hers. Robert had initially tried to maintain relationships with all 5 children, but it had proven impossible. The children from both families struggled to understand how their father could have divided his love and attention so completely, and many of them felt angry and betrayed. Eventually, Robert had moved to another state entirely, starting over in a place where no one knew about his past. 6 months after the confrontation on Catherine's doorstep, Margaret was working in her garden when Linda approached from across the street. Linda looked different than she had during the worst days after discovering Robert's deception. Stronger, more self-assured, like a woman who had discovered she was capable of surviving something she'd never thought she could endure. "I wanted to thank you again," Linda said, settling beside Margaret on the garden bench. "I know I've said it before, but I don't think I can say it enough. If you hadn't told me what you'd seen, I might have spent years more living a lie." "Do you really feel grateful?" Margaret asked. You're even knowing how much pain the truth brought? Linda was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Yes, I do. The pain was terrible, but it was clean pain, if that makes sense. It was honest pain, caused by honest truth, not by the constant nagging sense that something was wrong with my life, but not knowing what. The children are doing better too. It's been hard, but they're learning that they can survive difficult truths, and that's a valuable lesson. And you? How are you doing? Linda smiled, and Margaret realized it was the first genuinely happy smile she'd seen from her friend in months. I'm good. Really good, actually. I got a job at the elementary school, just part-time in the office, but it's a start. I'm making friends who know me as Linda, not as Robert's wife, and I'm learning things about myself that I never knew when my whole identity was wrapped up in being half of a couple. Any regrets? About confronting Robert? About ending the marriage? No, none at all. My only regret is that I didn't trust my instincts sooner. I wasted so much time doubting myself instead of investigating what felt wrong. Margaret nodded. I think a lot of women struggle with that, the balance between trusting their partners and trusting their own perceptions. The thing is, Linda continued, I used to be proud of the fact that I trusted Robert completely, that I never checked up on him or questioned his stories. I thought that made me a better wife than women who were suspicious or controlling, but I realize now that blind trust isn't actually a virtue. Trust should be earned and maintained, not just given automatically because someone has a title like husband. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the activity on Maple Street. New neighbors had moved into Robert's old house, a young couple with a toddler who seemed genuinely happy and uncomplicated. Margaret found herself watching them carefully at first, looking for signs of deception or hidden secrets, but gradually she'd relaxed. Not everyone was living a double life. Some families really were as happy as they appeared. I heard from Catherine last week, Linda said suddenly. Margaret looked at her in surprise. You've been in touch with her? Just occasionally. We both felt like we needed to stay connected somehow. We're the only two people who really understand what it was like to be married to Robert Carlson. Her kids are doing well in their new town. She started dating someone new, actually. A teacher at her school who's been divorced himself and understands what it's like to start over. And how do you feel about that? Linda smiled. Happy for her. We were both victims of the same man's deception. Why shouldn't we both get the chance to find real happiness with someone who's actually capable of honesty? As the sun began to set, Linda stood to head back to her house, where her children would be waiting for dinner and homework help, and all the ordinary rituals of family life that continued despite everything they'd been through. Linda, Margaret called as her friend reached the street. Do you think you'll ever be able to trust someone completely again? Linda paused, considering the question seriously. I think so, she said finally, but it will be different than it was with Robert. It will be trust that's built slowly, based on consistency and honesty over time, not just assumed because someone says the right words or plays the right role. I think that's probably healthier anyway. Margaret watched Linda cross the street to her house, where warm lights were beginning to glow in the windows. The Carlson family was no longer perfect. They were a single-parent household dealing with the aftermath of betrayal and deception. But in some ways, Margaret thought, they were more real now than they had ever been when Robert was creating the illusion of perfection while living his double life. The scandal of Robert Carlson's second family had shaken the entire community, forcing everyone to examine their assumptions about the families around them. Margaret found that people were more honest with each other now, more willing to admit when their marriages weren't perfect or their children weren't angels. The pressure to maintain the appearance of perfection had been lifted, replaced by a recognition that authentic imperfection was more valuable than beautiful lies. Margaret had learned something important, too. Her instincts about Robert had been right from the beginning. Something had felt off about his perfection, his too-good-to-be-true family life. She'd dismissed those feelings as cynicism or jealousy, but they had been warnings that she should have heeded sooner. In the future, she would trust her observations and her intuition rather than telling herself she was being paranoid. As she walked back into her own house, Margaret reflected on the profound lesson that Robert Carlson had unwittingly taught his entire community: that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving, that trust was precious precisely because it could be so easily shattered, and that the truth, no matter how painful, was always preferable to the most beautiful lie. The perfect neighbor had turned out to be perfectly false, but in the ruins of his deception, two families had found the strength to build something more authentic and ultimately more valuable. Lives based on truth rather than illusion. Relationships built on genuine foundation rather than carefully maintained facades. It had taken the destruction of one man's elaborate lies to teach an entire community the value of honest imperfection. And in Margaret's opinion, that was a lesson worth learning, no matter how painful the teaching had been.